Look, I mean, I don't want to overstate the radicalism of the project. I mean, people have imagined the future and before and tried to think about how the Constitution applied to it. You know, we're going to be a nation of immigrants in the next 50 years. What are their rights going to be? Right? That sort of thing, right? People do that all the time. Well, what would it mean if we freed the slaves? Would they have rights? You know, that sort of thing. So there's nothing unusual about the idea that, again, it only works in a society that actually cares about its constitution. But we do, and so there's nothing unusual about the exercise of sort of looking into the future and thinking about how you will respond as a constitutional polity to things. I think what it's unusual about this, and it's unusual about the project, it's also unusual about just the circumstance that we're dealing with, is that we have had, you know, generation upon generation of exponential technological development, both in the biological space and, you know, particularly in the electronic circuitry space. And we are getting ever smaller, ever cheaper, ever more powerful devices that can do ever more things. And the rapidity of that development is so extreme that it puts sudden and very dramatic pressure on a whole bunch of different well thought through assumptions about the way the society operates and the way the constitutional polity operates. And so I do think there's something different about that level of change. And I do think there's something, therefore, different about the need, instead of saying, oh, wow, we have all this speech going on online, now we have a Communications Decency Act, is that constitutional? And thinking very microcosmically about the specific issues that it raises. And that's a very valid thing to do, and you actually have no choice but to do it, because, you know, Congress passes a law, somebody sues to prevent the law from going into effect, you have to adjudicate that, right? So you have to think at that level. But our point is, zoom the lens out a little bit and look at the big picture. And the big picture is, it's not just, wow, the Fourth Amendment is under a lot of stress. Wow, the Fifth Amendment is under a lot of, you can look at the Bill of Rights pretty pervasively and say, gee, technological development is going to change our understanding of a lot of these things. And that's A, inevitable, B, it's not bad, but it does require a lot of thought. I'm not sure that's the most obvious one. I mean, I think the most obvious one, not sure if it's useful to debate what's more obvious, but I think the most obvious one, frankly, is the fact that we used to, and by used to here, I mean like a few years ago, have a lot of anxiety at the idea of people creating digital dossiers on us. And now Facebook came along and offered us the opportunity to do it to ourselves and each other in public. And we all said, oh, what a wonderful idea. And now we track each other. You know, our phones ask permission. Would you like us to track your location for this app? And we click, you know, eagerly, oh, please, you know. We stick up information about what we're thinking at a given moment, what we're buying, where we are. Please come rob my house right now. I'm not home. I'm off with, you know, Sophie at, you know, King's Dominion. Here's some pictures of me, you know, at the theater. I mean, you know, the level of information and intelligence collection that we're doing on ourselves on behalf of our friends is just enormous. And it's and you know, I don't remember, it's like 500 million people are you know, are doing this. So it's I think that is an enormous cultural change that just has huge, huge implications for all sorts of things, including, the way we govern ourselves. Right. Look, yes, it's not just a difference, there's a lot of differences. So start with a few obvious ones. First, the stakes are much higher, and therefore the capacity, the tolerance of failure is much lower. And the regulatory option of failure doesn't really exist. So we could take the view about Facebook, social networking, and all these various technologies that we have to, do intelligence collection on ourselves and each other, that, people want to do that, that's fine. That's actually sort of how I feel about it. I think it's an enormous cultural change. I certainly participate in it myself. I'm kind of aware of it, but I have a part of the back of my head that's anxious about it, but it's at the back of my head. It's not at the front of my head. You could also take the view, you have a lot of latitude as a policy matter here. You could also take the view that, gee, we think this is really creepy, and we're going to do all kinds of regulation to protect people in the context of these interactions. And that's sort of the European Union approach, right? Now, the counterterrorism national security space, and the reason you have that degree of latitude is that the stakes are relatively low. What's the worst that'll happen? Well, some people will have pictures of themselves that are embarrassing available to people they'd rather not see those pictures. Some people will, maybe not get jobs. Some people have their parents find out about their sex lives. That would be really unfortunate. But, as a society, we really can tolerate that kind of thing. It's and similarly, if you regulate aggressively, businesses may not make as much money as they'd like to. Some people may have less consumer product available to them than they would like to use, right? Again, these are very manageable costs from a social point of view. The national security space doesn't work that way, right? If you don't take the steps to prevent truly terrible things from happening, and the result is that terrible things happen, people die, people's sense of safety in the world is very dramatically altered. Some of the things that we have to hypothesize could happen are really terrible. Not suicide bombing type terrible, but, buildings falling down kind of terrible, or worse, epidemics of disease kind of terrible. So, you're talking about things that you have governments in order to prevent. That's the preamble to the Constitution, right? To provide for the common defense, right? The government really has no higher purpose than protecting people from catastrophe, from avoidable catastrophes. You can't protect people from volcanoes erupting that, Mount Pinatubo or whatever. But it can, to the extent that you're dealing with the preventable disaster. That's actually why we have, the Constitution is, among other things, a collective security document. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, it was one of the chief reasons it was written. People really forget that. But, what was the concern that led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787? It was the concern on the part of Madison, Hamilton, and George Washington that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate to the sort of collective actions necessary to protect the newly independent country, that there wasn't enough central coordination to do things. And the tolerance for failure is and should be lower than it is in other spaces. And as a result, and similarly, the burdens of those aggressive actions on individuals are higher. So if you compare it to the regulation of data privacy in the private sector, where you say, if Facebook uses your data very aggressively, what's the worst that'll happen to you? It's not that bad, right? Here, what the worst that'll happen to you is really, really bad, right? And similarly, where you say, and what's the worst that'll happen is if you fail if you regulate it aggressively and don't do it well. Here the worst that'll happen is if you act aggressively toward individuals who you shouldn't be. You might make errors about. The consequences are pretty high, and similarly, the consequences of the failure to do something are very, very high. So, I do think it's just profoundly structurally different in terms of both the necessity of significant government action and the consequences of errant government action. Yeah, I think there has to be. I mean, I think the idea that we are, as a society, going to sit passively as we develop technologies that allow, the individual to destroy the world, which, that's an exaggeration, but it's only a little bit of an exaggeration, right? We're going to sit passively and say, okay, we're going to sort of take a Second Amendment attitude toward this, right? That, we have these technologies that allow you, the individual, to do just incredibly horrible things. And, you really shouldn't do them, but we're really more afraid of government regulation and government involvement than we are of what you're going to do with, the fertilizer bombs that you can build, or, the biological weapons that you can construct. Or let's, the small robots, we don't talk about this in the book, but the small robots that you can build and do all kinds of amazing things with. And I think it's simply implausible. That's not the way any government has ever behaved, or at least no government that's still around. And there's a reason for that. They're getting less every day. We project force against individuals in Pakistan from Nevada. Eventually, individuals in Pakistan will project force against Nevada from Pakistan. That's what you see already in the cybersecurity context. Individuals in countries that don't have the same attitudes toward enforcement that we do, and maybe benefit by their activities, are very capable of attacking individuals, corporations, and government entities domestically, and by the way, in every other country, right? That's a reality of networked infrastructure, and we are dealing with that. And the more empowered the individual gets around the world, and that's a big long-term trend, the more you will have to think about security as a highly decentralized international enterprise.